The surrender of Hong Kong on Christmas Day 1941 was not just a military defeat. For the men of the Canadian Sea Force, it was a descent into a hell that had been specifically designed to strip them of their humanity. The Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada had been sent to the Asian colony as a show of force, a bluff to deter Japanese aggression. But the bluff had been called. After 17 days of savage fighting against overwhelming odds, fighting without air support, without naval reinforcement, and eventually without water, the colony fell. The Union Jack was lowered, and the rising sun was raised. For the Japanese victors, the surrender confirmed everything they had been taught about the West. In the Bushido Code of the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was the ultimate disgrace. A soldier who surrendered was no longer a warrior. He was less than a man. He was a captive thing, a ghost who had forfeited his right to exist. The Japanese looked at the exhausted, bloodied Canadians, many of whom were barely 20 years old, and they saw weakness. They saw a soft enemy who lacked the spiritual fortitude to die for their country. They sneered at them. They spat on them. And they decided that since these men had chosen life over honor, their lives would be put to use for the glory of the emperor. The initial captivity at the North Point and Sham Shui Po camps in Hong Kong was a brutal lesson in the economics of starvation. The daily ration was a bowl of insect-infested rice and perhaps a cup of watery soup made from chrysanthemum greens. The men began to shrink. Soldiers who had arrived in Hong Kong as strapping farm boys from Manitoba or lumberjacks from Quebec withered away into walking skeletons. Diseases like diphtheria, dysentery, and electric feet, a deeply painful nerve condition caused by vitamin deficiency, ran rampant through the barracks. The Japanese guards watched this deterioration with indifference. To them, the White Devils were simply expiring batteries, losing their charge day by day. But the Japanese war machine had a problem. As the war dragged on into 1942 and 1943, Japan was bleeding manpower. Most of their able-bodied men were fighting in the jungles of New Guinea or manning the garrisons of the Pacific perimeter. Yet, the factories and shipyards back in the Japanese home islands needed to churn out weapons at a furious pace to keep up with the American industrial juggernaut. They needed labor. They needed bodies. And they looked at the POW camps in Hong Kong and saw a reservoir of slaves. The journey to Japan was the next circle of hell. The prisoners were crammed into the holds of hell ships, unmarked freighters where thousands of men were packed into spaces meant for cargo. The heat was suffocating. The air was thick with the stench of dysentery and vomit. Men died standing up because there was no room to fall. They lived in darkness, listening to the terrifying ping of American submarine sonar against the hull, praying that their own allies wouldn't torpedo them. When the survivors stumbled off the ships in Yokohama and Tokyo, they looked like the undead. They were emaciated, filthy, and hollow-eyed. The Japanese civilians who saw them arrive covered their mouths in disgust. The camp commandants who took charge of them rubbed their hands together, not because they had received skilled workers, but because they had received disposable tools. These men were sent to the Kawasaki Heavy Industries, the Mitsubishi Shipyards, and the ironworks that formed the spine of the Japanese naval effort. The Japanese supervisors at the shipyards made a critical error in judgment. It was an error born of arrogance. They looked at the Canadian POWs and saw broken men. They saw prisoners who could barely lift a sledgehammer, who shuffled when they walked, and who bowed their heads in submission when shouted at. They assumed that the hunger had eaten away their brains as well as their muscles. They believed that these Western barbarians were too stupid to understand the complex machinery of a shipyard and too terrified to try anything other than blind obedience. they were wrong. Starvation takes away your fat, your muscle, and eventually your sanity. But it does not necessarily take away your hate. In fact, for the Canadian POWs, hate was the only fuel they had left. It was a cold, hard knot in the center of their chests. Every time a guard struck them with a bamboo cane, every time they saw a friend die of preventable pneumonia, the knot got tighter. They realized they were being forced to build the very ships that would carry supplies to kill their brothers fighting in the Pacific. They were being made into accomplices in their own destruction. And so, a silent, unspoken pact began to form among the skeletons in the shipyards. It wasn't a formal conspiracy. There were no meetings in dark corners, no written orders from officers. It was a collective realization that swept through the ranks of the Royal Rifles and the Grenadiers. They realized that their captors' arrogance was their greatest weapon. The Japanese thought they were stupid? Fine, they would be stupid. The Japanese thought they were clumsy. They would be the clumsiest workers the world had ever seen. The resistance began quietly. It started with what the soldiers called dumb insolence. It was a performance art. When a Japanese foreman gave an instruction in rapid-fire Japanese, the Canadian prisoner would stand there, mouth open, looking utterly bewildered. The foreman would scream, get red in the face, and slap the prisoner. The prisoner would bow apologetically, pick up the wrong tool, and wait for the instructions again. This slowed down production by minutes, then hours. If you multiplied those minutes by thousands of prisoners, you began to steal days from the Imperial Navy. But dumb insolence was just the warm-up. The real work began when the prisoners were assigned to the riveters. Shipbuilding in the 1940s was a game of millions of rivets. These hot metal pins held the steel plates of the hull together. They had to be driven in hot and hammered flat to create a watertight seal. It was hard, deafening work. The Canadian POWs developed a technique. They would heat the rivet just enough so it looked right, but not enough to bond properly with the steel. Or they would drive it in at a slight angle. To the naked eye of the inspector walking the catwalks 30 feet below, the hull looked perfect. But structurally, it was a ticking time bomb. The starving men realized that if they messed up every rivet, they would be caught and executed. But if they messed up every 50th rivet or every 100th, that was undetectable. They targeted the hard-to-reach places, the bilges, the double bottoms, the dark corners of the engine rooms where the inspectors hated to crawl. In these shadows, the Canadians went to work. They learned that if you mixed a handful of sand or metal filings into the grease buckets used for the propeller shafts, the abrasive grit would slowly, invisibly grind away the bearings. It wouldn't happen today. It wouldn't happen during the sea trials. But 3 months from now, when that destroyer was in the middle of the Philippine Sea trying to outrun an American submarine, the shaft would seize, the engine would scream and die, and the ship would be a sitting duck. The Japanese guards, blinded by their racial superiority complex, never suspected that the clumsy oaf dropping his wrench for the 3rd time that morning was actually a saboteur. They saw a weakling who couldn't hold on to his tools. They beat him for his clumsiness, never realizing that the wrench had fallen directly into the gears of a delicate winch mechanism. One of the favorite tactics of the Canadians involved the welding crews. As the war progressed, Japan switched from riveting to welding to speed up production. The prisoners were given crash courses and put on the assembly lines. A good weld penetrates deep, fusing the metal plates into a single piece. A bad weld, a cold weld, just sits on top like frozen gum. It looks solid, but hit it with a sledgehammer or a heavy wave and it snaps. The POWs became masters of the pretty cold weld. They would lay down a bead of molten metal that looked immaculate on the surface, It was smooth, it was even, it was art. But underneath, there was no penetration. There was no strength. They were building ships made of zippers that were waiting to come undone. There is a story of a Canadian soldier, a former mechanic from Winnipeg, who was assigned to the electrical shop. His job was to bundle the miles of wiring that ran through the ship to control the guns, the radar, and the communications. It was a chaotic spiderweb of cables. The soldier realized that if he simply cut a 2-inch section out of the middle of a wire, inside the rubber insulation, and then taped it back up, the break would be invisible. The circuit would be dead, but finding the break would require testing every single inch of mile-long cables. He did this randomly. He would snip a wire for the fire control system. He would snip a wire for the intercom. He worked with a terrifying patience. He knew that when this ship finally launched, the Japanese electricians would spend weeks tearing their hair out trying to find the ghosts in the machine. He imagined the captain of the ship trying to order a turn during a battle, only to find his rudder control dead because of a snip made by a starving prisoner 6 months ago. The Japanese shipyard commanders began to notice that their production schedules were slipping. Ships that were supposed to be finished in 6 months were taking 8. Launches were delayed by mysterious mechanical failures. Tools went missing constantly. Hammers, chisels,
and wrenches vanished into the bilges or were accidentally dropped into the harbor. The commandants raged at the guards raged at the prisoners. The beatings increased, but the beatings only hardened the resolve. Pain became the currency of the trade. A broken rib was the price of a destroyed generator. A black eye was the cost of a ruined fuel pump. The prisoners kept a mental tally. They weren't just victims anymore. They were combatants. They were fighting the Battle of the Atlantic from the dry docks of Tokyo Bay. And the guards, in their arrogance, missed the most obvious sign of all. They missed the eyes. When a man is truly broken, truly defeated, his eyes are dead. They look at the ground. But if the guards had looked closely at the starving Canadians, they would have seen a spark. They would have seen the flicker of a secret joke. They would have seen men who were hungry, yes, but who were feeding on something far more sustaining than rice. They were feeding on the knowledge that they were slowly, methodically, and invisibly taking the Imperial Japanese Navy apart, bolt by bolt. The sabotage was not without its moments of terrifying drama. There is a legendary account, passed down in whispers among the survivors of the camps, about the launch of a brand new escort destroyer at a yard near Yokohama. This was a prestigious event. Japanese naval officers in their dress white uniforms were in attendance. The shipyard commandant was preening. The band was playing patriotic marches. The Canadian prisoners were lined up at attention, forced to witness the fruits of their slave labor, filthy and skeletal in their rags. The blocks were knocked away. The champagne bottle, or likely a bottle of sake, smashed against the bow. The ship began to slide down the greased slipway into the water. It was supposed to be a majestic moment of imperial strength. Instead, as the stern hit the water, the ship didn't float level. It groaned. A terrible, metallic screech echoed across the harbor. The ship immediately began to list heavily to port. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, something deep inside the hull snapped. The pretty welds held for a second, then unzipped. The ship took on water rapidly, wallowing like a wounded whale before it had even left the dock. The silence on the reviewing stand was absolute. The Japanese officers stared in horror. The commandant looked as if he was about to have a stroke. And the Canadian prisoners, they stood rigid, staring straight ahead, faces like stone masks. But inside, they were screaming with laughter. They were roaring. It was the sweetest moment of the war. They knew exactly why the ship had listed. They knew about the seacocks left open. They knew about the ballast tanks filled with scrap metal on one side and air on the other. They had turned a warship into a joke. The investigation that followed was brutal. The Kempeitai, the dreaded secret police, descended on the shipyard. They interrogated the guards. They beat the prisoners. But they couldn't find the saboteurs because there were too many of them. Was it the welder, the riveter, the electrician? Or was it simply bad Japanese steel? The prisoners played the stupid barbarian card perfectly. "We just do what you tell us," they stammered. "We don't understand ships." The Japanese, unable to admit that their racially inferior slaves had outsmarted them, often blamed the materials or their own foremen. As 1944 turned into 1945, the sabotage became more brazen. The Americans were getting closer. The prisoners could see it in the sky. At first, it was just the lone high-altitude reconnaissance planes. Then it was the carrier raids. And finally, the B-29 superfortresses began to appear, silver giants gleaming in the sun, leaving vapor trails that looked like scratches on the dome of the heavens. The air raids changed the dynamic of the shipyards. When the sirens wailed,
The Japanese guards would run for the deep concrete bunkers. The prisoners, however, were often left in the open or told to take shelter in flimsy wooden sheds. They used these moments of chaos to do their best work. While the guards were cowering underground, the Canadians would run through the workshops. They would toss handfuls of sand into the greased gears of the lathes. They would loosen the bolts on the overhead cranes. They would start small fires in the blueprint rooms. Fire was the ultimate weapon of the saboteur. The shipyards were tinderboxes of oil, wood, and chemicals. A carelessly dropped cigarette butt in a pile of oily rags could burn down a warehouse that held months' worth of supplies. The prisoners became experts at delayed ignition. They would set a fire that wouldn't smolder into flame until they were marched back to the barracks miles away. They would watch from their camp that night, seeing the orange glow on the horizon, warming their hands on the memory of the destruction. But the most profound sabotage was psychological. By 1945, the Japanese propaganda machine was frantic. The newspapers proclaimed great victories. They said the American fleet had been sunk. They said the divine wind was protecting Japan. The prisoners knew better. They saw the ships coming back to the yards for repairs. They saw the jagged holes torn by American torpedoes. They saw the scorched decks where kamikaze planes had failed to launch. And they made sure the Japanese workers saw them too. The Canadians would work alongside the Japanese civilian laborers, old men and young boys mostly. When the guards weren't looking, the prisoners would whisper, "The Americans are coming," they would say in broken Japanese. "Tokyo is burning. Why do you fight?" They would point to the holes in the ships. "Look, this is what happens." They sowed doubt. They planted the seeds of defeat in the minds of the workforce. They dismantled the Japanese war effort not just physically,
but spiritually. The climax of their resistance came in August 1945.
The atmosphere in the camps changed abruptly. The guards, usually screaming and violent, became quiet. They looked frightened. The food rations, already starvation level, stopped completely. Rumors flew through the barracks. Had the Americans landed? Was it a massacre? Then, on August 15th, the Emperor's voice came over the radio. The Jewel voice broadcast. Most of the Canadians couldn't understand the archaic court Japanese he used, but they understood the reaction of the guards. Men who had beaten them for years dropped to their knees and wept. Some walked away from their posts and never came back. The war was over. But for the prisoners, the danger wasn't. There was a very real fear that the Japanese, in a final act of spite, would execute them all. The order, the kill-all policy, had been issued months earlier. If the Allies land, kill the prisoners. The Canadians in the shipyards armed themselves. They made shivs out of scrap metal. They stockpiled rocks. They prepared to fight their last battle in the barracks. But the executioners never came. Instead, the sky opened up. The first sightings of the American carrier planes flying low over the camps were terrifying. The prisoners dove for cover. But the planes didn't drop bombs. They dropped sea bags. These bags were attached to parachutes. They slammed into the ground, bursting open like piñatas. The starving men who weighed 80 pounds, men who had eaten bugs to survive, rushed forward. They found cans of peaches. They found condensed milk. They found chocolate. They found cigarettes. There is a famous story of a Canadian soldier who sat in the mud holding a can of peaches. He opened it with a bayonet he had stolen from a fleeing guard. He ate the peaches with his fingers, the syrup running down his chin, weeping uncontrollably. It wasn't just the sugar. It was the taste of victory. It was the taste of survival.
When the American occupation forces finally reached the camps, they were horrified by what they found. They saw living skeletons. They saw the scars of torture. But as they interviewed the men, as they toured the shipyards, they began to piece together the other side of the story. They found ships that wouldn't start. They found guns that misfired. They found rudders that jammed. Post-war inspectors estimated that in some shipyards, the efficiency of production had been reduced by nearly 40% due to the clumsiness and incompetence of the slave labor. The Japanese guards had underestimated their enemy. They had looked at the Canadians and seen only bodies. They didn't understand that a soldier doesn't stop being a soldier just because you take away his rifle. They didn't understand that resistance is a state of mind. The men of the Sea Force returned to Canada, but their war didn't end on the docks of Yokohama. They carried the physical and mental scars for the rest of their lives. Many died young, their bodies broken by the years of starvation and abuse. For decades, their story was largely overshadowed by the battles in Europe. They were the forgotten soldiers of a lost colony. But in the annals of military history, their achievement is unique. They didn't win their war with artillery barrages or tank charges. They won it with loose bolts, cold welds, and sand in the gears. They proved that even in the darkest pit of human suffering, stripped of everything but their breath, a group of determined men can still find a way to fight back. The Japanese guards had mocked them as captives. They had laughed at them as they starved. But in the end, as the Imperial Navy sat rusting and broken in the harbors, unable to sail to the defense of its homeland, the last laugh belonged to the skeletons in the shipyard. They had been hunted, beaten, and starved, but they had never been disarmed. Their weapon was their will, and with it, they helped sink an empire.